You are listening to a podcast from The Hindu.
Today we are going to discuss cop-outs at the climate talks.
This is a very special episode because joining both of us, we also have our colleague Priscilla Jebraj, who's in Chennai. And Priscilla is somebody who's actually covered three of these climate talks at Bali, at Poznan, and at Copenhagen. And she's got a lot of amazing insights to share with us. I had a conversation with her earlier today on these aspects. I am Jacob Koshi.
And I'm Shobna Nair, and this is the
Rearview. Here we dive into the history of things, events, discoveries, and inventions.
Despite repeated warnings of dangers up ahead.
News editors the world over yawned last week when history was being made at the World Climate Conference in Berlin. And it is not surprising. Tedious 6 a.m. wrangling over words in square brackets grips readers less than murderers facing the electric chair. Not that there was a lack of passion at the conference. At least millions and probably billions will live or die as a result of the action which will follow the Berlin Mandate. Jacob, that was Guardian's environment editor Paul Brown writing from 1995, Berlin, the first ever COP.
You, the parties, now stand before the eyes of the world, entrusted with the decisions needed to promote the effective implementation of the Convention.
Wow, the Conference of Parties. That is pretty historic. That was the time, I guess, Angela Merkel was the German environment minister. This was the first COP, that is, it came 3 years after the Rio de Janeiro summit, in Brazil in 1992. And that was this iconic moment in world history when, the countries of the world gathered together and laid out the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Charter, where they basically agreed that there is this thing called anthropogenic warming. Greenhouse gases are heating up the atmosphere, and if the world doesn't do something about it, the consequences could be catastrophic. Next year, it'll be 30 years. It'll be the 30th Conference of Parties meeting that presumably should happen in Brazil. Again, it's kind of like a full circle from Rio de Janeiro.
Before we get into the drama of COP, for which we are here actually today, I want to give a quick synopsis of this 30-year period of COP, and I'll take you a little further back. For the first 23 years of its existence, United Nations did little talk on this issue. And whatever little conversation happened, it was more on the fear of conserving natural resources. And the main platform of discussion was the World Meteorological Organization. It was only in 1970s the world decided to sit up and take notice of the storm headed our way. The first Earth Summit was held in Stockholm, Sweden from 5th June to 16th June 1972, where along with tea, biscuits, and finger sandwiches, some platitudes were served.
Politicians in particular and people in general began to realize we were in the middle of an environmental crisis. I think Maurice Strong has done an absolute miracle of even getting people to come here and putting together this sort of conference.
But nevertheless, it was the first time the word climate change was used. But let's fast forward to 1995. The first conference of parties was held at Berlin, and as you said, it was chaired by Angela Merkel. It was little more than an agreement that something needs to be done and needs to be done fast. So in 1997, the somber heads of the signatory countries met at picturesque Kyoto, Japan. Now, here comes the drama. It was at Kyoto that they decided a protocol for 2008 to 2012, which required developed countries to undertake specific legally binding obligations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and follow a set of rigorous rules to track compliance. But here comes the twist, or rather, the firewall, which developed between the developed countries and the developing countries. The developing countries put up their hands, and rightly so, saying they cannot sign on any new commitments.
So this was the Kyoto Protocol was, the first of the COPs where there was something like a semblance of decisive action. I mean, countries had agreed that yes, the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is a lot due to emissions by countries that are now considered the developed countries, and because they are kind of responsible for the bulk of the concentrations, they have to do more. Unfortunately, this was the world still runs on fossil fuel, and developing countries that time like China and India, they cried foul. They said that we too have the right to continue to grow and expand our economies and become developed countries in the future, and that cannot be done without fossil fuel. And interestingly, this argument continues even today. That is the this basic divisions were laid down, right then. But even that time, the developed countries, while accepting that certain countries must take more of the blame for it and therefore pay up more to fix this problem, they also said that big countries like, they might not be technically developed yet, but somebody like China or what they call major emerging economies, they too must somehow take a share of the blame. And there has always been this attempt that, some countries, I mean, nobody really questions, for example, the small island states, several of those in the Pacific Ocean, who stand the most to lose the most from warming seas.
Kyoto was obviously bound to fail because guess what? The biggest country and the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, United States of America, was not on board. In June 2001, President George W. Bush unceremoniously took the US out of the Kyoto process altogether.
The approach taken under the Kyoto Protocol would have required the United States to make deep and immediate cuts in our economy.
With the US and all developing countries on the sidelines, the protocol covered less than 25% of global emissions.
So he was the first US president to actually walk out of the COP.
Yes,
and not Donald Trump.
And here we keep blaming Mr. Trump.
Shame on you.
From Japan, let's now jump to Paris. 2015, it broke new ground because for the first time, the agreement was universal. There were no exceptions. The onus was not only on the developed countries, it sought to break the firewall, not casting it aside completely, but refashioning it. So the developing world had to be helped financially to meet the climate goals. While Paris was this watershed moment in the COP history, there was more drama.
The Paris Agreement was momentous because it followed up years of stalled negotiations, and finally it came to a conclusion that yes, developed countries will pay up, will have to take on compulsory emission targets. They have to cut, for example, by 20 by 2020 they must actually cut emissions by a certain by 50%. That's what the European Union agreed on. But all countries in the world also voluntarily agreed that they would also do their bit. And this would mean that, even countries like India and China, they also set what is now known as nationally determined contributions, where it is stressed that, it is not compulsory, but this was voluntary. But they would also, the developed countries are supposed to pay up. I mean, in Copenhagen, just going back a little, in Copenhagen 2009, it was agreed that by from 2020 to 2025, nearly $100 billion a year would be mobilized, and this target would be this number would be revised upwards. So, but Paris was a time when all countries decided that something must be done. You have to keep temperatures below 2 degrees centigrade of pre-industrial times, and as far as possible below 1.5 degrees centigrade. So these numbers, 2, 1.5, they are like they are the reason why the Paris, so it's called a Paris Agreement, as opposed to many other COPs that are either just accords or declarations or road maps,
Or
or
mandates.
mandates. Yeah, exactly. So an agreement is a thing, and there was apparently a lot of French maneuvering and French whining and dining,
I'm sure.
as
And the setting also helped, I
I
guess.
guess, yeah, and because the world was prepared to to deliver something big at that
The
moment.
world was prepared, but there was one man standing against the rest of the world: Donald J. Trump.
Nobody can do it like me. Nobody.
On June 1st, 2017, at 3:30 p.m., addressing reporters from the Rose Garden of White House, he declared,
I am fighting every day for the great people of this country. Therefore, in order to fulfill my solemn duty to protect America and its citizens, the United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
and his argument was that the deal was unfair to the US because it, as per him, gave a greater leeway to India and China.
This has primarily been the US position. I mean, when George W. or when Barack Obama has been at the summits, the opposition, who would be the opposition party in the United States at that time, would actively call out their sitting presidents, or who was present at the COPs, that all of these negotiations, if it didn't involve major countries like the UAE or China, it would be unfair to the United States. And the US is always, that's why the US in general has always been this country that, I don't know, continuously needs to be placated and it actually exits and goes off from the it. Even in Kyoto, it didn't actually sign it. I mean, it signed, but it didn't ratify. They had to actually coin up this term called ratification as opposed to signing. So it's always this dance between the US and the EU, and trying to mollycoddle the US into coming back. And I don't know, maybe it'll happen this year again.
Jacob, talking about this year, I've been meaning to ask you, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be in Baku?
I should have been, actually, but it's two things. One, I actually went to Baku earlier this year, and this was a COP related event, actually, where the administration over there showed some journalists the kind of preparations that were on for and Azerbaijan is also an economy that is completely dependent upon
On
oil.
oil, yeah.
So there was this whole set of separate controversies around it being quite how oil is critical to its national development. But other than that, Shobna, it just takes 2 weeks. Every COP is just 2 weeks long, and usually the first week is just delegations from different countries coming in, planting their flags, and having a pre-decided notion of what they are going to say. And there are lots and lots of meetings that are happening, in multiple venues, but there is very little progress. Can you remember what is the last story I wrote on COP? Just, you don't know that, see? And the one before that, you don't know that. I've already done 3 stories on COP, and if you, a persistent reader and thorough follower of news.
Do not expose me in front of the
No,
world,
it's not. I mean, this
and
is
in front
exactly.
of the Hindu readers.
Absolutely not. But this is very symptomatic of COP coverage, because in the
That's
first week,
exactly what Paul Brown said, right? The news
yes,
editors are yawning away.
you're not alone, Shobna. This is the general sentiment of news readers everywhere. So the first week is kind of bland, full of technicalities and legalese, full of acronyms. As when we were earlier talking to our colleague Priscilla, who's actually covered COPs in Bali, Poznan, and Copenhagen.
Part of it is that the senior people come only on those last couple of days. From Copenhagen onwards, it's been heads of state often, but even ministers turn up in that last week. The first week is all these bureaucratic negotiators. So I suppose they don't have the power perhaps to make the final decision. But it's also that at the end, those last few days are politicians speaking. So then they're making politician speeches, right? And you hear all these emotional speeches, especially from those from island nations and those from who have the most to lose, supposedly. will make all these emotional speeches. So perhaps because they're more political than bureaucratic. Though that's what I was telling you earlier, that the most emotional breakout I saw was by a bureaucrat. The Director General of the UNFCCC, Ivo de Boer, he's a proper UN bureaucrat. I believe he'd been a Dutch bureaucrat before, and he on that last day there was some. I mean, it had been stopped and stopped and stopped, the negotiations on small things so many times. And finally, then they thought they'd reached an agreement. And I think the Chinese came up with something which they said no. And he actually burst out crying within the chamber. And he had to be taken out in tears. So, I mean, he was dubbed the crying Dutchman for that.
But it's in the second week that sometimes it's become a little more high profile. I mean, you have world leaders coming in.
So she has covered three COPs and you've covered one, right?
Physically, I've just covered one, but I've always been writing about
From a distance,
from a
saving
distance,
the carbon.
saving the carbon. Yeah, I'm conscientious about what I write.
Very, very. And that is why you would prefer to work from home also, to save the carbon, right?
Obviously, I'm always the climate warrior.
But anyways, since I haven't been to COP and I have never really covered, I did the next best thing. Over the weekend, I read Landing the Paris Agreement, how it happened, why it matters, and what comes next. An insider's account of what happens at COP by Todd Stern, former special envoy for climate change
He was the main negotiator for the United
for
States. I think.
several years. Yeah.
Yeah,
Of course,
he's got some interesting tales.
yes, of course, with Mr. Trump's coming in, we will have a new person, and we should maybe sometime talk about Trump's
Yeah,
views. So he has this lovely thriller that he mentions in his book about incident in 2009 COP at Copenhagen.
Copenhagen was different. It was much, much bigger. So they had, apart from Mr. Obama, they had 100 heads of state. So there was crazy security in town. I mean, whenever the COP goes to a city, they sort of take over. But Copenhagen, they sort of took over the whole country, it felt like. I managed to get accommodation within the country, though not in Copenhagen. But there were colleagues, there were other journalists who only got accommodation in Sweden, and they actually had to come across by there's a sea link. There's a train that goes over the sea, and they had to come every day from another country into Copenhagen to cover it. It was that crowded. I can't remember. It was like an hour on the sea, I think, if I remember right.
On the last day of the COP 2009 at Copenhagen, President Obama arrives. There is no resolution in sight. He had just won the Nobel just last week. So obviously, he had that added swagger when he walks onto the stage. And of course, there is the added burden of additional expectations that this man will definitely have a magic wand.
The question then before us is no longer the nature of the challenge. The question is our capacity to meet it.
in fact, I remember that, because his campaign was all on hope, remember the whole hope thing? It was actually called Hope in Hagen, that was kind of the big motto that was, and this was, Hope in Hagen came before people actually were calling the COP the COP in Copenhagen. Look at all that tongue twister there.
That's a tongue twister.
It was actually called Broken Hagen because people actually had very little expectations, but here was
this
Mr.
star.
Swaggering.
Yeah. So
Obama.
now he lands there, and the US team cannot locate the Chinese premier who Mr. Obama wanted to meet. He wanted to meet the then Chinese premier Wen Jiabao to thrash out the agreement. But Wen was nowhere to be found. Well, he didn't exactly go missing, only the Americans couldn't locate them. It took them hours to track him down, or perhaps that is an exaggeration. Any which way, when the Americans finally found him, Obama decided to go and meet him without really scheduling a meeting or calling and deciding the venue for the meeting. He just he crashed into a meeting. Now, I want you to imagine Obama walking in wide strides, few paces ahead with Hillary Clinton and rest of the team trailing
Was he wearing
behind.
aviator glasses too?
Just you keep imagining, keep putting this stuff on his head or whatever. It turned out Wen was sitting with Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, President Lula of Brazil, Zuma of South Africa. Now Stern writes, the press was there to dutifully cover the meeting, and this group, Jacob, if I'm not wrong, is called basic, right?
Yes,
The
yeah.
India, China.
Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. So
why
these are
would
the
why would they get such a basic name?
because they were the big major economies, and these were also see because of the size. They were all developing countries, but because of their size, their their aggregate emissions were really high. So in fact, informally, it is these kind of countries that developed worlds have constantly tried to isolate and single out, saying that, yes, you are developing, but you will soon be, at the pace at which your economies are growing, you will be developed soon. That will involve, huge amount of emissions. So you need to be treated developed. So these countries, blocks are constantly being formed at COPs, and there are all kinds of acronyms like LDCs and LMDC, like-minded countries. So there is the Africa
That's
Coalition,
very Gen Z of
AICLC.
them,
It's not
yeah.
even, it's classic UN, I mean, no, diplomaties, I guess, to come up with acronyms for at the drop of the hat. And that's what makes covering COP negotiations so complex.
Yeah,
Keeping
mind
track.
boggling. So here's what Todd Stern wrote. The press was there to dutifully cover the meeting. That is Manmohan Singh, Lula, Zuma, and Wen Jiabao's meeting. Yet all of a sudden, unannounced and uninvited, here came the US president with Secretary of State and scrum of senior advisors heading straight for the door. TV cameras swing around, reporters scramble this way and that. Security tried to block the door to the room. President Obama, ever calm, collected, confident, brushed past security, opened the door, looked at the astonished faces of the four leaders and their aides, and said pleasantly, are you ready for me now, or should we wait? And for the next several minutes, the discussion was not exactly on the climate goal, but on the phrases.
Phrases.
Yes, on what will be politically acceptable to all the nations. So Obama wanted that the word scrutiny should be inserted in the final resolution. Scrutiny basically committing all the developing world
To
to
open
be,
their to
yeah,
to have their climate actions,
under,
open to transparent. And
yes.
there's also scrutiny in another sense, that that, okay, there is billions of dollars being committed towards climate finance by developed countries towards developing countries. But there has always been the objection by developing countries that if you're just going to be investing in renewable energy projects, that's just business. Those are just business investments. But real aid should come in the form of concessional loans, or even grants, or even transferring, complex technology that can then be used by developing countries. So there has to be a consistent and transparent manner of reporting finance flows. So that all comes under the whole what he probably hinted at as scrutiny.
Imagine that was not the all the drama Copenhagen had in store. The in the final session, the plenary session, a Venezuelan negotiator, Claudia Salrino, cut her hand and waved her bloody hand and said,
Did she actually cut her hand?
yeah, apparently she slashed her hand.
Jesus, I thought it
And
was a plastic hand with tomato
with what,
ketchup.
tomato ketchup?
Yes,
That's
and just waving around.
Trump.
Really?
Tomato ketchup is a Trump thing.
Boom. Roasted.
I don't think the Venezuelans
Jesus,
were
I can't
doing
imagine
that.
somebody actually shedding literal blood
Yeah.
to get something out of there.
And then she sort of cried, do you think a sovereign country has to actually cut its hand and draw blood?
Does Stern say, did she faint? Was she hospitalized?
No, I think she was far stronger than that. But Jacob, tell me your crazy stories of COP.
Oh, so I mean, the blood story is what is one of the legendary stories from COP. But even last year, at Dubai, proceedings in COPs can be pretty, boring beyond a point. So there was this one important set of meetings going on where, you had the governing body on the chairs, and lots of chairs were empty, and many of the diplomats were kind of half dozing and some of them speaking. And suddenly there is this 12-year-old girl from Manipur,
Wow.
Likpriya Kangujam.
Let's unite, let's act, and let's deliver.
And she suddenly runs onto the stage and kind of, shouts out saying, lies, lies, all leaders lie, people die, act now. She was holding some kind of a placard, and for a while all of those the negotiators, the diplomats on the stage were kind of woken up. But surprisingly, it's not as if they were alarmed. They continued sitting, maintaining kind of stoicism. So it's kind of,
Because
people
they're used to
expect that
it, yeah.
these kinds of things happen. And she was, she went from one end of the stage to the other, and after some time there was, I guess, the UN provides security at these venues. So there was a UN official who was kind of chasing her around and, trying to not touch her, but also trying to block her view. And she spent nearly a minute over there. And this was a very Greta Thunberg kind of pull off. Again, the famous activist, like Futures for Friday, and she too had her own stints at the COP, right?
She actually made her name of these protests. But I have a funny story about Greta, and I hope chances are low that Greta is listening to this, but I hope she forgives me for this. But 2019, the meeting was scheduled to take place, the COP was scheduled to take place in Brazil, but President Bolsonaro decided he wasn't in the mood to host because climate change, well, there is no such a thing. Then Chile put up its hand but had to withdraw amidst massive demonstrations and riots about corruption and rising inflation. Spain opened its doors and the conference was held in Madrid. Of course, by this time, climate activist Greta Thunberg had reached across the Atlantic, only to be told that the venue has shifted.
Yeah, and I believe that Bolsonaro even described Greta as a brat, in the same conference, because she had criticized violence against indigenous communities in the Amazon basin. And your favorite president, President Trump, actually tweeted at Greta during COP25 saying that she should work on her anger management and go to a good old fashioned movie. So these are all classic retorts at Greta.
He should have taught her the tomato ketchup throwing anger management skill that Trump specializes in.
And in fact, Priscilla had this another very interesting anecdote regarding crowd activism and people getting angry at Copenhagen.
I believe they threw bricks. I believe that there was some brick throwing and people were arrested. But yeah, hardly anything like in India. No, again, I believe there was some fasting involved, but I don't think it was, the Anna Hazare style, I'm going to die unless not quite that.
So even in COP27, this was the one in Egypt at Sharm el Sheikh, there was this, but this was more in the prelude to to the actual COP. Sana Saif, the sister of jailed Egyptian British dissident Alaa Abd al Fattah, she marched in the front line under a banner reading, "You have not yet been defeated." That was the title of Abd al Fattah's book, which became a rallying cry for summit activists.
Without human rights, we are not yet defeated.
Abd al Fattah was sentenced to 5 years in prison after he was found guilty of violating protest laws in Egypt. So this was when, the president Abdel Fattah el-Sisi had led a coup against Hosni Mubarak's successor, Mohammad Morsi. So Fateh had begun this long fast, very Gandhian form of fast, where he began consuming only 100 calories a day, and many other people then joined on. But unfortunately, this was once the COP started and the COP ended, nothing really, he was never really set free, and coverage has moved away, and I think he still continues to be in jail.
What I find really ironical is that here you are coming together to save the world because of climate change, because we are burning too much fuel, which is creating so much of carbon, is increasing our carbon output. And here you have world leaders flying from across the world and sitting in one place, and they're burning so much of energy.
Not everybody's as conscientious as me, Shobna, who closely monitors climate talks through the UN webcasts and the portals.
Clearly,
But this
clearly.
is but this has always been this classic criticism of of climate change. I mean, you've had Elon Musk also, and you have frequent appearances by Bill Gates. All of course on private jets, and in fact, in my conversation earlier with Priscilla, she had a few things to say about this.
There's always this question about, you're talking about climate change and carbon emissions, and you fly all these people and waste carbon every year from across the world. So one of the things they tried to do to blunt such criticism was that they tried to reduce the air conditioning, and they tried to coax people that therefore, because all these men wearing three-piece suits and stuff, imagine with reduced air conditioning in tropical Indonesia. So they tried to convince them to wear they gifted them Indonesian clothes, traditional, those batik clothes. So it was really funny to see some of these staid European diplomats attempting to wear batik and colors and all of that. But part of it was that they reduced the AC. And I mean, Bali is a beach resort, so that was sort of everywhere outside the conference hall. That's the vibe, right? It's December in Bali. It's tourist season. The hotel we were staying in was a tourist hotel, and every morning at breakfast, people are dressed in swimwear, ready to jump into the sea the moment they're finished. And we had to head to the conference center right after we finished. But they tried the same thing the next year in Poznan, which was the other part of the world, right? Poznan in Poland. It was freezing cold in December, and they reduced the heat in between conference rooms. The conference rooms would be warm, but in between areas where you were eating and all of that, and you shiver in these coats. And yeah, this is part of their effort to actually say that they believe in reducing emissions.
Climate jets and flying in was a very rallying point, calling out the hypocrisy of cops, because negotiations are so slow, so tortured. Well, the proverbial planet burns, and we shoot past all the scientific assessments of how much emissions ought to be controlled to prevent 1.5 and 2 degrees of heating. But in recent years, this has kind of faded away, from what I have seen over the years. And that's because there has been increasing participation by fossil fuel companies. Now going green is now a huge business industry. This was not the case even in 2007, 8, 9, or even earlier, when 5 or 10 cops had happened. But right now you have most of these fossil fuel companies either looking into banking on carbon credits, or they have schemes to invest massively in solar and other renewables. So because of this business focus, this climate hypocrisy angle has kind of diminished over the years. In fact, at COP28, this was one of the big themes. And in Sultan Ahmad Al Jaber, who was the COP29 president, he was also the president of one of the UAE's most prominent oil companies. And the Guardian and several other outlets ran extremely critical coverage, calling out a presidency's dual role. That is, on one hand, you sit on a fossil fuel empire behemoth, but on the other hand, you are expected to have countries of the world listen to you in a way where countries are expected to cut down their use of fossil fuels. So this same theme was repeated in a small way, in Azerbaijan too. So this is all part of the dynamics that are typical in all of the COPs through the years.
Before we end our conversation on COP, it would be a miss on our parts, Jacob, if we don't talk about the COP that was held in Delhi in 2002. Then Environment Minister and DMK leader TR Balu was the chairperson of that COP. However, Delhi COP did not receive rave reviews.
Nobody even knew it happened
In
in the
fact,
climate circles.
yeah, really? Okay, so I was reading a down to earth article which called the final draft released by Delhi as a miserable one, and a miserable document, because it pretended that the Kyoto Protocol did not exist and issues such as mitigation ratifications weren't mentioned. And the draft meekly called on industrialized countries to implement their commitments under the convention. And some delegates felt that it was a copy paste job, relying on bits of earlier declarations. And then there was whole conspiracy theory that US was, they already agreed on the declaration and they wanted a weak declaration because no outcome is a good outcome for them.
So those are all the times when, in fact, most people don't even remember that there was
That we
actually
had a COP
that there
here
was a
in
COP in
Delhi.
India. It must have been, I don't even know where it was held. Maybe it was held. I don't think there was even there was much
Buzz.
media or,
But imagine if COP was to return to India and
and
to Delhi.
your dreams are probably going to be, I hope you don't dream about things like that. But now that you've asked for it, Prime Minister Modi in COP28, in fact, it was one of the big stories that came out of COP28 last in Dubai. PM Modi was in attendance, and he, after his customary meetings, in his final, big bang kind of announcement that he really, in the style that he likes, he said that India would like to host the 33rd Conference of Parties Summit in 2028. And we all saw how the G20 was organized in Delhi, right? I mean, all the show and fanfare and all those things. And you bet how 2028 is going to look like in Delhi. Like, I'm frankly, Shobana, already scared about what's going to happen 4 years from now.
But Jacob, if the COP maintains the schedule that it does, imagine having COP in November in Delhi, in the gas chamber that we are living in. Let's hope, just for the COP's sake, that our government does something about this.
That's the truly terrifying thought, because in its early editions, the COPs were usually in December or, second week December. But now they're increasingly shifting to November. And as you pointed out, November is now the inauguration of the 3 toxic months that we routinely face in Delhi. So there have actually been exhibits, for example, in the Glasgow COP, again, a significant COP in terms of climate action. The Glasgow COP, there was actually an exhibit where, there was this artist come engineer, where, he set up these simulation rooms where people could experience what it was like to breathe in polluted cities. And guess the star attraction was the city of our livelihoods, from where we are hosting this.
So that's all from us today. And till we see you next time, it's goodbye from me, Shobna.
And goodbye from me, Jacob Koshi. Bye.